Well, welcome back to your group. This is week 4 of For This Reason, our journey through the book of Philippians. And this is probably a really great place for us to make sure we understand where we have been to this point. So once again, Philippians is a letter written by a follower of Jesus named Paul to some friends that are part of a church in the city of Philippi. And he's writing this letter while under Roman guard, imprisoned for preaching the gospel, namely the message that Jesus is Lord in a world that considered the Caesar to be Lord. As a matter of fact, that's where we began in week number 1, right in the middle of chapter 2 with the gospel. And when we say gospel, we mean that Jesus gave up his position as equal with God, became a human, took the form of a servant, going to the cross, taking the punishment for sin, experienced an excruciating death by crucifixion, but did not stay dead, but rather was raised back to life by the power of God, and elevated to his status as equal with God once again, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow, every tongue confess that he is indeed the Lord. And if we believe that and say that and want him to be the leader of our life, we can be saved, and we're added to this church. And I've been suggesting all along that message of the gospel is the central thread that holds the entire letter together. Because we then moved back to the beginning of the letter and Paul's call for us to become partners in that gospel message. And as partners in the gospel, not only do we all embrace the gospel message, but we serve selflessly, we fight for unity, and we give generously. And in this past week, we spent some time on Paul talking about himself and the gospel, that just because he was in prison, the gospel was still advancing. And that was happening where he was, but also out in the community. And we landed on the question of, how can my story be used to advance the gospel? And I hope you've done some work in the last week to walk through the things that have happened in your past and where you are right now, and your expectations and anticipation of the future. And I hope you've been able to maybe even identify that thread of the gospel through your story to see how it might be used to advance the message further. And so where we come today is the end of chapter 1, and then we're going to jump over to the beginning of chapter 4 in what Paul is encouraging everyone with. Basically, make sure that you're living in a way that you're actually a credit to the gospel message. The phrase he uses in both places is this: contending together for the gospel. And contending has this idea of fighting side by side, as we might think about the military. It carries the same idea of a team sport where people say they're going to battle together. And what Paul is saying is that the people who embrace Jesus as Lord should be fighting alongside of each other to see that message spread further. But when you jump over to chapter 4, he calls out 2 people by name, and he said, hey, these people stopped fighting together, and now they're fighting against each other. This is the one concern of all the entire things he writes about in the letter that gets raised in what is mostly a letter about thanks and gratitude. It seems like it's such a big deal because this fight between the 2 women had likely infected the rest of the church. And so now all of the focus and attention and energy that we were putting into the gospel gets squelched and redirected in a disagreement with each other. And what happens when we fight is that we tend to forget. We forget all of the shared experiences we have had that brought us together to begin with. Right? We forget that we have common bonds that have united us. We forget that we're playing on the same team. Paul appeals to this church, and I think it's an appeal to us as well. Don't forget that you're partners. You're engaging in and contending for the most meaningful work there is. Let that transcend any personal fighting that's shifting your focus. Again, it takes a proper understanding of what the gospel is and how it is central to this letter, because Paul appeals to it over and over and over again as the foundation for how to live a life that is a credit to this message. Because what a tragedy to preach that Jesus beat death, he forgives sin, and has the power to change any life, but then not show it has enough power to solve a disagreement between teammates. So the question for us to answer is very simple. is, what does it look like for us to contend together for the gospel? And what might our community think and potentially believe if they saw us united in that effort?